right, so before we jump in, we're going to do some quick review on where we even got this whole idea of little kings, and it's based on the book of Judges, and it covers a length in history. Let's go to that first slide. Okay, so this is about a time of 310 years. This takes place in the history of Israel from when Joshua dies to King David. It's 310 years. This is the bleakest time in Israel's history. And this is the time before Joshua died. They promised Joshua that they would always follow Jesus, that Jesus would be that God would be their king, that they would never turn their backs on God, that they were going to follow him forever. Joshua dies, and the funeral food isn't even cold before the Israelites decide that they're going to drift away from God. Because they decided that they were going to follow this philosophy. And the philosophy is this: they wanted to do what they wanted to do, when they wanted to do it, with whoever they wanted to do it. That was the philosophy that they were starting. Their neighbors were Canaanites. They watched their neighbors. They saw their neighbors prosper. They saw how happy they were, how well things went, and so they started to shift their eyes away from God to their neighbors. And they actually, last week, we started to talk about how they started to compare themselves with their neighbors. And so that caused them to drift. And then they followed this toxic cycle for 300 years. They would disobey God, they would crash and burn, and then they would ask for deliverance. They would disobey God, they would crash and burn, and then they would ask for deliverance. And they did that over and over and over and over again. And they thought, because they were willing that they were doing whatever they wanted, when they wanted, with whoever they wanted, that would give them an enormous amount of freedom in their life. The problem is it did the complete opposite. They actually became enslaved, literally, by other nations. And so tonight, we're going to continue this whole idea of this little kings, because see, God made it very clear to them that he was going to be their king. They didn't need earthly kings. They had a king, and he's God. And so, but what the Israelites decided to do is they decided to chase after all these little kings. And for 300 years, they chased after all of these little kings, and completely the opposite of what they thought was going to happen took place. Instead of freedom, their little kings caused them to be enslaved. And that's true in our own lives. So I've got some little kings up here that kind of represent some areas of our lives that these little kings want to take precedence over. Okay? And so last week we looked at a little king known as comparison. And we had, we learned something about comparison. We'll see if you can remember what we learned. Okay. I said there was no blank in blank. Do you remember what we said about that? There is no blank in blank. There is no win in comparison. Right? There's no win in comparison. Whether you are comparing yourself to somebody that has more than you, is better than you, whatever it is than you, or somebody that is not as much as you, does not have as much as you. So either way, that's a no-win situation. Okay? This week we're going to look at comparison's kid brother. Okay? And so this week we're going to bring to the front this thing called greed. Greed. So I'm just going to throw this out there. I want some feedback here. Tell me what is greed? Give me some, what's having too much? Okay. What is greed? Not being content. Okay, what else? Right. Never enough. Right? So I found some different sayings about greed. I'm going to read some of these to you, okay? I will make a confession. I was on Pinterest this week, just so you know. Okay. Here's one. This one says, successful people are always looking for opportunities to help others. Unsuccessful people are always asking, what's in it for me? Okay, here's another one that I found. Greed is the lack of confidence of one's own ability to create. I thought that was interesting. How about this one? It is the preoccupation with possessions more than anything else that prevents us from living freely and nobly. Here's one. He who is not contented with what he has would not be contented what he would like to have. And then there's this one. I thought this was good. Greed is not a financial issue. It's a heart issue. Right? All right. So I'm going to give you the one thing for tonight as we jump into this whole thing called greed. Here's the one thing I want you to get, and it's this. Greed is the assumption that it's all about my consumption. Greed is the assumption that it's all about my consumption. Okay? So there's a story in the book of Luke that Jesus tells about this whole idea of greed, but how the story starts out is a little strange. Because it doesn't seem like it goes with this whole idea of greed at first. Okay? So Jesus is with his disciples, there's a big crowd around, and then this one guy steps up to Jesus and asks him a question. Okay? This is in Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 13. Listen to what this guy said, asked Jesus. Then someone called from the crowd, "Teacher, please tell my brother to divide all our father's estate with me." That's weird. Like he yells it from the middle of the crowd, right? Okay, so first off, for some reason, this guy believes, right, he thinks that he can use Jesus to solve this relationship problem that he has with his brother. Okay? The truth is, this request that he has a lot of layers to it. Lots of layers. Okay? In fact, it's not just about money, it's about relationship. Okay, there's a broken relationship here. Okay? So I love Jesus' response. Listen to what he says to this guy. Jesus replied, "Friend, who made me a judge over you to decide such things as that?" Okay, so let's stop there for a second. So this guy is like, "Hey, Jesus, would you just tell my brother to pay me what he owes for our inheritance?" And Jesus goes, "Friend, who made me a judge to decide about that?" I mean, sometimes there's things that we just need to work through as human beings between each other. Okay? And not play the God card. Okay? We just need to work through it as human beings. Okay? Okay, listen, I've had conversations with people, I'm not kidding you, when either somebody's called me up. In fact, this just happened. I just had lunch with somebody this last week. They wanted me to fix somebody that is their friend. They wanted me to fix him. Okay? We had lunch together, started talking about what was going on and stuff. And so this happens like frequently. When somebody will talk to me and they'll say, can you just, especially like marriage counseling? Oh my gosh! Are you kidding me? Would you just fix my husband, please? Right? It's like, my wife, what? I don't know what's going on with her, man, but can you just fix that, please? Right? Ooh. And I'm like, I can't fix anybody. No. Oh no, I'm not here to fix people. No. I can speak truth. Yeah. Right? So this interaction takes place, and then Jesus says something very it's like, what? In verse 15, he says this, then he said, beware. Guard against every kind of greed. Life is not measured by how much you own. So Jesus knew exactly what the core issue was. Okay? Jesus wasn't like all the other rabbis back then that people would go to. They went to these rabbis to solve their earthly, materialistic issues. They would go to a rabbi and say, this thing's happening in my family. Can you come and help fix it? Okay? Jesus wasn't like that. Okay? He was the Messiah who came to represent and get us focused on eternal things. That's why Jesus came. All right? Jesus is saying this, okay? Listen to what he's saying. Jesus is basically saying, even if one were to gain possession of every molecule of riches in the universe, one's life consists of something different. It has nothing to do with your possessions. Your life is different. So this story that Jesus is telling is kind of forcing us to ask some very core questions. Am I preparing for God's kingdom? Am I contributing to God's kingdom? Am I preparing for God's kingdom? And am I contributing to God's kingdom? So all of this is taking place, and then Jesus tells this story. In verse 16, it says, then he told them a story. A rich man had a fertile farm that produced fine crops. Okay, so to a Jewish mind, as they're hearing this, to a Jew's mind, if you have acreage that produces, to them, they're like, God is blessing you. You're experiencing God's blessing because this ground that you have is producing fruit. That is showing that God is blessing you. Do you know in our Christian culture, do you know what term we use for that? Increase. Increase. And that term has been used and abused. There are tribes in the Christian culture, It seems like that's all they preach about is increase, 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 right? Yeah. And I've counseled with people where they have followed that philosophy that you being a Christ follower is all about experiencing the increase. And I have talked and counseled with people that have come to me that have been a part of that tribe for years and years, and it has destroyed them. Destroyed them. And so Jesus is telling this story about this guy that had this farm, and it was doing well. And then he says in verse 17, he said to himself, what should I do? I don't have enough room for all my crops. I don't have enough room to put all my produce in. What should I? Then he said, I know. I'm going to tear down my barns and build bigger ones. Then I'll have room enough to store all of my wheat and other goods, and I'll sit back and I'll say to myself, my friend, you have stored enough away for years to come. Now take it, eat and drink and be merry. Because this guy assumed that it was all about him consuming. He assumed it was about consuming. That's what he thought. So he said, I'm going to figure out how to store it all so I can continue to consume it any way I want. It had very little to do with using his surplus to help anybody. There's no gratitude, seeking God's guidance. Jesus wasn't condemning blessing from hard work. Please get that. He was not. In fact, I got a story to tell you. And I'm going to show you an image on the screen. Okay, I want you to listen to this story. This story is called Dying to be Rich. Listen to this. From times when men were iron and ships were wood comes an old story about a group of men on a boat who made their way to an island supposedly full of gold. They divided into two groups. Those who would dig for gold and those who would plant seeds, cook, and make arrangements for the sustenance of life on the island. But as they began to find gold, they got more of the men who were involved in planting seeds to start digging for gold. As time progressed, there were fewer cooks and planters and more men hauling gold. Eventually, they began to use parts of the ship to reinforce the shaft so they could go deeper and deeper and find more gold. And as the story concludes, others arrived on the island years later only to find a group of skeletons draped over great treasures of gold. There's nothing wrong with having. There's nothing wrong with having much. Jesus never attacked wealth. He always attacked motives. Okay, so Jesus continues this story. This guy has barns. He's going to build bigger ones so he can just consume however he wants. And then verse 20 says this. Jesus says, "But God said to him, 'You fool, you will die this very night. Then who will get everything you worked for?'" One of the commentators, when I was getting ready to said this about this. Listen. "For all of his planning, the man failed to plan for one universal, 100% event each person must face: death. The Lord didn't require grain or money or possessions. He required the man's soul. And ironically, others would enjoy the financial bounty of his planned retirement. And then Jesus continues, yes, a person is a fool to store up earthly wealth but not have a rich relationship with God. In other words, Jesus is saying, if you're looking to earthly treasure for security and sustenance and significance, you won't seek satisfaction from God. That is a huge issue in our Christian culture today. I'm telling you, there are so many people that say they believe in Jesus, but they're not following Jesus, especially when it has to do with this little king. There are so many people that are allowing this to rule in their life. And it doesn't only have to do with money. This is a heart attitude. This is a heart attitude. So I'm going to give you some greedy truths, okay? You need to understand these truths. They're in your program jacket there, okay? First one is, I am not what I have. I am not what I have. Second, don't place your faith on what is temporary, because it can be taken away like that. I've been in a situation where I've lost everything twice in my life. God's promises to meet my basic needs. Read Matthew chapter 6. Jesus says very clearly, if you seek my kingdom first, my righteousness, all these basic needs that you worry about, food, shelter, clothes, I will provide for you. 4, focus on the eternal, not the temporal. That's having a kingdom mindset. That's how you use your money, how you are at work, how you are in your relationships, how you are at Walmart, how you are getting gas, how you are at the restaurant. Number 5, blessing is not how much stuff I have, but how much God I have. 6, generous living will break the grip of greed in my life. I want to read something to you. I have it on my phone. This is brutal. This is brutal. But it's true. Listen. Generous living will break the grip of greed on your life. So whether or not you think you have extra, give and give generously. You've got to give to the point that it forces you to adjust your lifestyle. If you're not willing to give to the point that it impacts your lifestyle, then according to Jesus, you're greedy. Ouch. If you're consuming to the point of having little or nothing left to give, you're greedy. If you're consuming and saving to the point that there's little or nothing left to give, you're greedy. I know that's strong, but actually it's harsh, but it's true. It's true. So I have a little test. Just a little test for you guys to take, okay? Here's the first part of the test. To ask yourself, here it is. This is also in your program jacket, so you can do that later. But The questions are, am I ever content with what I have? Second question, do I feel like I always have to get more? Third question, does the pursuit of things ever consume me? Okay, so I'm going to share a story about, so a couple Christmases ago, I think, Peter, how long have we had that one 3D printer? Peter, how long have we had that one 3D printer? The first, what? 5 years ago. Okay, so let's say 5 years ago. So 5 years ago, Peter and I decided we were going to do something different at Christmas. So we started to hear about this new technology. It's called additive manufacturing, but the normal term is 3D printing. So we started to talk about 3D printing, and we started to go, man, maybe we should get one of those because it sounds really cool, right? So we started to do some research. Like, we researched a lot. And we finally found this one that we could get from Czechoslovakia. Woo! Okay? But we had to build it. Okay? And so I was like, oh, I got to bite the bullet. Okay, I'm going to order this thing. And so it took 2 months to get here. But in the meantime, we looked at, all these YouTube videos on how to put the thing together and all the things. We looked at the guy that owned this company, Joseph Prusa, in Prague, Czechoslovakia. And we looked at all of these. Okay. And we talked about the printing all the time. We talked about what we're going to print. To say we were consumed with that for 2 months is an understatement. Okay? We were consumed. All of our thoughts, everything we were doing, we were consumed. The thing with this little king right here, he wants us to stay in that place. Where we are constantly consumed with the idea of having more and getting more. Paul said something very interesting. He said, I have learned the secret of being content. Did you know? Paul said, I learned the secret. I learned how to be content with much, and I've learned how to be content with hardly anything. Do you know what his secret is? His secret is he chose, this is not going to be my little king. He's going to be my king. He's my king. He's the one. He's the one that provides. He's the one that takes. He's the one. So, on this one side we have greed. On this side we have gratitude and contentment. Greed, gratitude, and contentment. Do you know what gratitude is? This whole idea of gratitude? I have a definition for you. It's this. Living satisfied with thankfulness. That's gratitude. Being satisfied with thankfulness. That's gratitude. And I thought about this. Do you know what would happen in your life? Let's say that you decided to live like this for 5 years. 5 years. You decided, you know what? I am going to live with gratefulness and I'm going to live with generosity for 5 years. Okay, listen. Your personal finances would look very different if you did that. You would have less stuff. You would be in less debt. You would have more margin. And you would have more savings. I guarantee you. If you decided to live like that. So I got some questions to ask you. Where does greed occupy a place in your life? Where is it? Like I said, it's not just stuff or money. Could be time. Second question. Where have I been afraid to be more generous? And then the third question, why have I been afraid to be more generous? And of course, along with that is the whole idea. You know what? God wants us to be wise with our finances. He wants us to pay our bills. But he goes, remember last week how we said that he wants us to have one hand open all the time. All the time. So he can give and he can take. Because when both of our hands are closed, it's really hard for him to give us anything. Right? So I got a great song for us at the end here. Okay? For those of you that are watching us on Facebook Live, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We love our Facebook Live family. Praying for you. Thanks again for loving our ministry and being a part of the redemptive story that God is writing down here. And we'll be praying for you throughout this week. Pray that you'll really take to heart what we talked about today, and that you would allow God to replace that little king of greed with him in your life. All right? We'll see you guys next week.